this evening to share her experience, her knowledge, and expertise with regard to the impact of climate change on various species and their ecological communities. Heather is one of our own, having grown up in the Ottawa area and having been inspired by time spent at a family cottage in Western Quebec. Her undergrad and master's studies took place at Ottawa University, followed by a doctoral study program at the University of British Columbia. Postdoctoral work took Heather to UC Davis in California, so I'm thinking Heather's probably bilingual, speaking fluently both Canadian and American English at this point. Heather's current role is as an assistant professor in the biology department at Ottawa U, where the Kharouba lab conducts research on global change ecology. It's heartwarming to see the cadre of dynamic young people engaged in this work with her, a number of her postgrad researchers focusing on the interface of insects and plant life in the Ottawa Valley area. The physiological adaptations that are occurring as a response to climate change are particular points of interest in their research. Heather teaches 2 courses at the undergrad level, conservation ecology and ecosystem biology, and she supports 4 to 5 grad students and 2 undergraduate students each year. It's a pleasure to peruse the Kharouba Lab website and see the warm collegiality that Heather has clearly fostered amongst her students and fellow researchers, and to see the breadth of research study in which they're engaged. We're indeed very fortunate to have such a dynamic and talented scientist with us. Thank you, Heather, for speaking to us this evening, and I want to express a special note of thanks to you for very generously gifting us with the honorarium that we offer to you as our presenter. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Heather Kharouba.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me just get the technical side sorted out before I sort out more.
Share your screen now, Heather.
So yes, you would see my full. Hold on. So do you see? You probably see the main slide now.
Yes, we do.
Like not the presenter slide or with my notes and everything. You just see the title, right? Just to check.
Yeah, just see the full slide. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because sometimes I don't get it quite right on Zoom still. So yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I don't usually often have such a personal introduction, so thank you so much for spending the time on putting that together. And thanks to everybody joining tonight. I know it's your St. Patrick's Day, and so thanks for taking some time away from the celebrations to listen in. For the most part, I'm not sure how rosy my talk will be, but anyways, hopefully it'll give you some food for thought. I guess a couple of just quick comments before I get started. Anyways, maybe we can chat more about it afterwards. I'd be curious to know more about the nature notebooks that you were discussing at the beginning, because a lot of my work does use data like the data that you've been collecting for so long. So I'd love to know more about it. And then the other side of things is that I have, through my teaching and through my experience with or exposure to undergraduate students here, young students right now are, very keen on getting involved with their communities in different ways. And so if you could think about some ways where we could, suggest opportunities for young people to get involved and in this kind of organization that you're doing, it would be great. So just to point that out, that I often try and let my students know of different opportunities that I come across or ways that they can get involved in their communities. And they're especially hungry, these ecology students, for, experience in this discipline, because these kind of experiences are harder to find. Yeah, so I started the university in 2016. And so, yeah, just to say a little bit more about me. And so as Leslie mentioned, I did have my some of my training at this university, and then I moved on and was lucky to return. As you'll notice from my title slide, I decided to go a little bit more broad in my talk today. And so I hope I won't lose some of you right away. So I'm going to talk about climate change, but I'm not only going to talk about climate change. And it's partly because we have a lot of ongoing research now in the lab, and I wanted to focus on research that was more local and more research that you might relate to more than some of my other work, which is a little bit more climate change focused, but it can be a little bit harder to relate to because it's on a broader scale. So just as a caveat as I get started, that in general, my motivation is climate change, but a lot of my students are interested in many different issues. And so, anyways, that's where I'm starting from. So, the other challenge for me today was actually putting together a talk that's going to be short enough. So I might be a little bit quick to get through all of my, all the content I want to share with you today. So I organized my talk, again, because we have so many different projects going on in the lab. I thought I would actually focus it or organize it around, I would say, the three most important global change drivers. So climate change is one of the global change drivers, but so is habitat loss and degradation, and so is species introduction. So I'm going to talk about our research within each of these three different areas. And they each have their own challenges and their own, importance. And so that's how I'm going to organize the talk. And so just to say at the outset, again, obviously was in the title that was shared, but climate change is increasingly becoming a major factor in biodiversity loss. And in the next few decades, climate change is likely to rise to the forefront of threats to biodiversity and endangered species. So right now, it's not necessarily the biggest one currently, but we definitely have projections suggesting that it's going to be. And that's because the scale, the duration, and the severity of climate change separates it from other environmental issues. And so climate change is the one threat that exists everywhere. It can't be reversed only by local actions. So we really do need, collaboration across countries and globally. And so even if today we were to reverse all of our actions, we are still going to be paying for the actions we've already had. And so climate change is definitely a challenging issue. The second one I'm going to talk about is habitat loss. So habitat loss and degradation right now is the most serious threat to biodiversity, largely because it's so sweeping in its effects. And so, of course, in the absolute sense, when you have a habitat conversion or loss, you result in a complete change in the community and the ecosystem states. And so, again, you lose all biodiversity. But at the same time, habitat degradation can also eliminate or reduce populations. It simplifies, it disrupts communities. And so habitat loss and degradation is the primary cause of extinction right now globally. And then finally, we have species introduction. So this is, again, the third global change driver. And so we, as you know, we live in a world of introduced species. So we have European trees in Africa. We have African dung beetles in Australia. We have Australian possums in New Zealand snails in North America. There's introduced species everywhere, and the list goes on. And so in terms of their number and ubiquity, the scale of biological invasions is just staggering. And so today, the rate of human-caused introductions like that of extinctions exceeds background rates, at an unprecedented scale. And so it's a major, major issue for us. And so I'll be talking about that later in the talk. So that's the outset premise for my talk. And so within the climate change theme, I'm going to talk about two research areas that relate to climate change, just so that you can see how we try and address it. Climate change is actually a really challenging issue because the scale of which you either have to study it at a really broad scale or at a really small scale. And so that can prove challenging for student research projects. But so, this was the sort of theme of the announced talk or my advertised talk, but I find a lot of my work is focused on phenology, and I find phenology really interesting. And so that's basically what your notebooks are, about. And so right now, climate change is really complex, but we know that phenology is one of the most commonly reported species response to climate change. And so phenology can be so many different seasonal life history events. So it could be the timing of migration, the timing of senescence in the fall, as leaves turn color, any of the differences in life cycle stages, timing of flowering. And so there's a lot of them. And so phenology in this area in our temperate region is really important because, as we all know, there's only a certain part of the season or the whole year where we have conditions that are favorable enough for organisms to grow and reproduce. And so this timing is really important. If organisms can't fit in their life cycle, then they face mortality, they face other consequences for their development and their species. So getting the timing right, especially in our regions, is really, really important. And I'm also interested in it because it has broader scale impact. So we can study phenology at a really small scale. We can study it in the lab, in the field, but then it has implications for ecosystem structure and the way things are functioning. So it's a really interesting characteristic of systems. And again, it's one of the ways that it's been most commonly reported responses of climate change, and partly because it's pretty easy to track relative to other things that are changing. So there's lots of things we don't know, but what we do know so far is that, like I mentioned, so climate change is causing species to shift their phenology. So the timing of when they are performing their activities. And so we know that these shifts are different across species and different functional groups or in different trophic levels. And so in most cases, these events are getting earlier in the year, but some of these events are getting later, and it depends on the species and the place. So there's a lot of complexity and variation. But what this results in is the fact that we end up with, we now have documented evidence that the timing of species interactions is changing with climate change. So we have, in these pairwise interactions where you have really closely interacting species, one species is changing in one way and the other is not. And so this leads to a lot of different implications. And so I've tried to illustrate it in the simplest way I can think of on this figure here. And so this is basically an average, host plant and insect herbivore before climate change came into play. So in a regular season, average season, generally what happens is plants come out, they leaf out, and then herbivores become active because of course they need leaves to complete their development. So host plants will emerge first in the season, and then insect herbivores come out. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of variation with how species are responding to climate change. And so there's so many different combinations of things that can happen. And so in this case, I've sort of shown the most extreme way, just so you can get, again, sort of a picture of what can happen. And so in this case, I have the insect herbivore getting earlier in the year. So it's shifting to become earlier and when it becomes active in the season. But in this hypothetical example, the host plant is becoming later for whatever reason in the season. So we have this complete mismatch that's happening. So we have, again, insects coming earlier and host plants becoming later. So there's less time, there's less overlap between these species when they co-occur in their season. And so this has potential implications for the insect herbivore and for the plant. And so one of the things I'm really interested in studying, and same with my students, is trying to figure out, well, first of all, predicting when these overlaps are going to happen, or these mismatches are going to happen, and what kind of consequences that means for different species and different species interactions. So in terms of a local example, we've sort of started with the most complicated one, but for a lot of different reasons, this actually ended up being a very complicated interaction to think about, but it's an important one. And so in one of the ways to understand when and where these mismatches are going to happen because of shifts with climate change, one of our focal species is the monarch butterfly. And so I'm sure all of you know that the monarch butterfly is highly endangered, or it's getting to be more so and more so. And so even though it's been really well studied, we actually don't know that much about how the timing of its interaction is going to shift. And so we sort of tried to address some of these questions using the monarch butterfly. And so this first study I'm going to talk about, we combined some field surveys around Ottawa and a field experiment to explore the likelihood or the potential that eastern monarchs in this region, which we know are at the northern range limits of its distribution, what's the likelihood that the monarch is going to face negative consequences, negative implications from these potential shifts in the timing of its interactions with milkweed, which is its main host plant in this area. It's its own host plant. Sorry, it's the only host plant in this region. So what we don't know, so we have a lot of gaps in our knowledge. What we do know is that this interaction is likely to experience some kind of shift in their interaction, but it's hard to know exactly how that's going to be. So we have some guessing work to do, and we need to support it with some more research. So we do have some long-term monitoring that is suggesting that the timing of fall migration in monarchs is happening later and later over recent decades. We have some evidence suggesting that the timing of when they arrive in the region has gotten later, but that data is a little bit messy, so it's hard to say. But overall, the models predict that there is going to be some kind of disruption in this interaction. We think there could be potential consequences for the monarch because they are so specialized on milkweed. And so if anything happens with that interaction where we have that mismatch, the monarch might be out of luck because it is so specialized. It can't use anything else in terms of, well, when it's in its larval stages. On the flip side, it might not be so sensitive to these changes because it has so many generations per year. We don't know exactly how many in this region. We think about 2 to 3. That's another area of research. And the other thing is milkweed in this area has a pretty long growing season. So even if there's some changes that happen either in the start of the season or the end of the season, we do have a fairly large season. Anyways, we still wanted to know, okay, so what can we learn about what's going on in Ottawa right now and what's the likelihood of this happening, these sort of disruptions happening. And so what we did was we wanted to know the kinds of plants that females prefer when they lay their eggs. And based on their preference in terms of plants, we wanted to look at how long those plants were available in the season. And so again, if this, with the idea that if the timing of egg laying changes with climate change, their preferred plants may not be actually available when they need them to be. And so again, this might have downstream impacts on the monarch's ability to, gain enough resources so that I can fly back to Mexico. There's all sorts of, resulting implications. So we sort of took this as a first step. And so again, we wanted to look at that sort of seasonal availability of these plants that the monarchs prefer. And so what Sydney did, she was a master's student in my lab a few years ago. She went out and sampled, as you can see on this map, a bunch of different sites across the Ottawa area, and she looked to see which kind of plants the monarchs were using primarily when they want to lay their eggs. And then she tracked what kind of plants they were. And so in general, where they were laying their eggs were on plants. We already kind of know this, but it was good to have this extra data, especially in Ottawa. So we know, so they generally lay their eggs on plants that are in earlier developmental stages. So plants that are in a pre-bud stage or a bud stage, plants that are shorter, they're younger, they have lower levels of leaf discoloration. Basically, they're younger plants. And so there was this preferred plants, again, earlier stages of development. And so based on this, we looked at the seasonal distribution of what those plants were looking like. And so here's the distribution across the season. So Sydney looked at changes or monitored basically the development of milkweed from the mid-June to mid-September. And so here you can see the different colorings of the different life stages or developmental stages of milkweed plants. And so at the bottom here are the younger stages, and then plants get older. And so they have anthesis and then post-anthesis. And so you can see that for the entire season, actually, the majority of plants are in these young stages. So they're either in these pre-bud states or in these bud states. And basically these are the stages that the monarchs prefer to lay their eggs on. And so you can see that there's this distribution there's a seasonal availability of these preferred plants throughout the whole summer season. And so that's good news for the monarch, because again, if the timing changes, well, we know that the preferred plants are still available through the whole season. And so there's a little bit more buffering that we can expect the monarch to have because of that. The other thing that Sydney wanted to do was we did a field experiment where we tried to see how sensitive the growth of monarch caterpillars are to different stages of plants to sort of corroborate what we were seeing in the field. So we did this field experiment where we looked at how well they grow on different sized plants. And so these are the statistical results, which I don't need to get into, but basically we found that the age of the plant didn't have any effect on the development of the caterpillars on these plants. And so they developed at the same stages or the same rate, they grew to the same size. And so there weren't any negative consequences of being on smaller or larger plants. And so again, overall, this suggests that the study suggests that there's unlikely to be negative consequences, at least, to some extent, if there's these disruptions in this mismatching, this temporal overlap, if climate change does change the timing of their interaction. And so, there's lots of future work that we need to do, but in sort of like an ecological research point of view, it starts to question, how often are these mismatches going to happen, and what kind of consequences are they likely to have? And so this is an ongoing field of research. But anyway, so that's one way we've been looking at it. The other climate change related project is a totally different scale, totally different topic. And so climate change, one of the biggest factors that's changing is that temperature is changing with climate change. And we know for insects that temperature really is a huge physiological limitation. And so to understand how species are shifting, changing in response to climate change, we really want to know how well these species respond to temperature to begin with. And so what we know so far is when climate change has led to species shifting their, geographic ranges across space in response to climate change, it's usually when there's a relaxation of these harsher climates in our area. So basically when winters are warmer, because low temperatures throughout the year are such a huge constraint to insects. And so a lot of work has been done on winter because it represents such a considerable challenge to insects. A little bit less work has been done on what happens in the fall when insects are developing their cold tolerance, they're going through physiological adjustments, but at the same time, we can have fall frost that happens. And so these organisms might not be ready for, when frost happens, and we know what the timing of frost has also changed with climate change. So we really that's where we started with this giant swallowtail. We wanted to know whether the timing of fall basically has changed with climate change and whether that could be a resulting factor in why the giant swallowtail has shifted its range. So just stepping back for a second. So the giant swallowtail, as you can see here, has a really large geographic distribution. So it's found from our region all the way down to Florida. And in the past 10 or so years, the butterfly has been shifting northwards into Ontario, and in Ottawa over the last 10 years, at least, it's shifted in. And so we've been trying to figure out what is it about climate that's changing, that's allowing the species to exist in Ottawa when it wasn't formerly here. And so again, the sort of first hypothesis we thought about was, well, maybe it's something to do with when fall frosts are happening, and maybe the insect is too sensitive to the timing of frost and the cold temperatures that are experienced in Ottawa in the fall. So that's where our starting point was. And so I had this, Philippe was a student of mine a few years ago. And so I won't get into a lot of the details, but I'm happy to answer any more of the, address some of the details if you have questions about it. It's a little bit technical, so I didn't want to get into too many details. But basically, we started with doing some physiological tests on the caterpillars later in their summer development period and the early fall to figure out how sensitive they were to cold temperatures and see, again, is this something that could be a constraint on when the species has been able to shift into Ottawa. We then used some modeling to use the information that we had gained in the lab to see how this corresponded to what we've seen over broader spatial distributions. And so the two approaches combined, both the modeling and the physiological experiments, suggested that actually has nothing to do with the fall temperature. So the larvae themselves are quite cold tolerant to cold temperatures. So they can survive with very low temperatures, and certainly lower temperatures than we experienced in Ottawa in the fall. And so we sort of rejected this and said, okay, it's nothing to do with the changing of fall conditions in Ottawa. That's not the reason why they're able to survive here now. And so at least this initial project suggested it could be something to do with the length of the growing season. So it could be the fact that summers are getting longer now. So it's not so much what's happening in the fall, it could be summer, and it could also be something about the winter. And so our next sort of projects are trying to figure out, okay, let's test some of these other ideas. And so the first thing we're trying to sort of pilot studies to see whether these swallowtails can survive the winter here. So you can see the experiment that's going on right now. We just want to track and know for sure that they can survive at these temperatures in the winter. And so we have a few out there this winter as a sort of next step of, can they survive winters here? And if they can, we might try and transplant them further north to see how they do. So those are a couple of the projects that are going on in the lab based on climate change. And again, I'm happy to get into more details if you have questions after. It's definitely a quick overview. But I'll just finish by saying on the climate change side that, again, the underlying, aspect that's really the driving factor are these changes in temperature. And so we really need to know how temperature, sort of like a really basic level, is affecting species at different levels. So again, like what we were doing in the lab, and then across broader scales. And that's where we'll really be able to better predict how climate change is going to impact these species. Shifting gears now, and so we're going to talk more about habitat loss and degradation. So again, as I mentioned at the outset in my introduction, so habitat loss and degradation, again, account for a lot of different or threaten a lot of different endangered and vulnerable species of a lot of different taxonomic groups. And so the work that I'm going to talk about now, it's talking about combined between habitat loss and degradation. And so degradation, we're really thinking about the modification of the environment in a bunch of different ways. And so it could be, again, a complete removal of habitats. It could be the fragmentation of habitats, or it could be the reduction of quality of key habitats. That's really where we get into this degradation happening. And again, so in all regions of the world, the most prevalent threat currently is habitat loss and degradation. So irrespective of where you are, right now, it's the major contributing factor to species loss and extinction. This is an example from a local region just to show, again, that as you, I'm sure, have all noticed all these different landscape changes. And so this is just, a snapshot of one area around us. And so this is a snapshot or aerial picture from Spratt Road Woods in 1976, and then again in 2017. And so there's a lot of different changes happening. And so in some parts, you can see there's urbanization happening. So you have complete habitat loss here, but then in other areas, you have this regrowth. And so in 1976, there was poor agricultural land here because of sandy soils. And so they decided to protect it wasn't a woodland there, but it's now a woodland, as you can see in the bottom picture here. And so anyways, it's just that there's so many different changes that are happening. And so it's a little bit of a complex problem in the sense of trying to figure out what exactly are the changes and what changes are most important for species. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of different projects related to this global change driver. The first one is it's basically considered historical ecology, actually. And so going back to the monarch butterfly, so again, we know the monarch over the past couple of decades has really been declining drastically. So its population is, again, and there's a lot of different reasons for why this is happening, but one of the main reasons why we think monarchs are declining so much is that there's been huge losses of their host plants. So milkweed plants, in Canada and the US, and this could be the reason why we have so few monarchs. Interestingly, though, we actually didn't have any historical evidence in Canada that actually showed how much change we've seen in milkweed populations. And so that's really what we wanted to focus on here, was actually coming up with a first number in Canada to say, this is the quantity, this is the magnitude of how much milkweed has changed in Canada. So this was a study that we did around Ottawa again. And so we stumbled across the study that was done in 1944 and 1945 by two botanists that had been called upon to basically figure out how much milkweed we had in the province so that they could help with the war efforts to figure out, whether to contribute latex. And so they were tasked with counting milkweed stems in most of Southern Ontario. And so they spent they spent 2 summers going on trains all across. Anyways, the route is quite enormous, and they drove along roadsides to figure out what kind of counts we had of milkweed at the time. And so this is, you can see a newspaper clipping from the efforts overall to incorporate, how important milkweed was back then. And this is one of the pictures that they took along their journey. And so we took advantage of these surveys, and then we did a current survey so that we could compare what happened. And so this was an undergraduate student's project. And so she went to, so she surveyed 100 roadside sites around Ottawa, as you can see in this map here. So she had a whole bunch of different sites, and we tried to line up our surveys as best we could with what we think that they did back in 1945, so that we would have a direct comparison where possible. And so we basically compared the number of milkweed stems, like the density of milkweed stems, what we found this was done in 2018, again, compared to what these two botanists found in 1944, 1945. And so the results of her study are shown summarized in this histogram here. And so historically, from this historical study, they estimated that there was about one stock for every mile. And so when we went back in 2018, to the best of our knowledge, to replicate what they did, well, you can see there's two different estimates. So and that's why I have this huge range. So overall, we found a substantial decline, but our ability to say exactly what that number is a bit tricky because of the uncertainties with their estimates, the historical estimates. So if we take one, based on one metric of this sort of, this distribution, if we take the median of this, our estimate is 0.15 stocks per meter. If we take the mean estimate is 0.84. So regardless of which one we use based on our current days, you can see it's still significantly lower than what they found in 1944 and 1945. So there has been a decline in milkweed, but you can see we can't tell you whether it's 33% or whether it's an 86% reduction. So we have this large range, and the bottom line is we can't tell you exactly where it is. It's somewhere within that, but it's a substantial decline. So again, this was the first study actually in Canada to give some estimates of how much change there's been in milkweed densities. So switching gears a little bit and talking about a different project. So this is now focused on butterflies. And so another aspect of degradation is really about urbanization. And so urbanization is on the rise globally. And so it's really prompting scientists to examine what the effects of urbanization are on ecological communities. So about 55% of the global population live in urban areas. About 87% of Canadians live in urban areas. And so again, we need to understand how biodiversity is influenced by urbanization so that we can inform policy and management, urban planning, et cetera, so that we can better conserve these communities in and around cities. And so I had a student that was really interested in the impacts of urbanization on butterflies. And so urbanization can potentially affect butterflies in many different ways. So directly through habitat loss, through chemical use, through mortality, like direct mortality from increased traffic, there's a whole bunch of different reasons here. And some of the factors might actually have a positive effect and some of them might have negative effect. And so our ability to say ahead of time what the impacts on butterflies were going to be was challenging. And so that's why we did the study. The other thing is urbanization might actually favor some species over other species based on some of their characteristics. So for example, generalist butterfly species, so those species that feed on a variety of different plants, have actually been shown to be more common in urban areas, and these are in other regions, so not in our region. But from other studies, it's shown that generalist butterfly species might benefit from urban areas. And so we wanted to know, in our communities, how these butterflies were changing in response to urbanization. So Steph, my PhD student, so she went out and we actually looked at the urbanization gradient in Montreal rather than Ottawa. So she went out and looked at 44 sites across this gradient. You can see here is the aerial map of Montreal with the different land covers. So she went out and surveyed butterfly communities in a whole bunch of these different areas to see how they responded to urbanization. And so here is a bunch of different figures, but I'll tell you the bottom line. But so she's looked at a few different indicators. So she looked at the number of butterfly species found in these regions or sites, how many individuals of a given species were found there, and then the evenness of the community. So how similar species are in terms of their numbers overall. And so she found across this urban gradient that when you have a higher percentage of urban land cover around a site, that you have a decrease in the number of butterflies that you find here. At the same time, you have an increase in the total abundance of the species that are there, but that overall you have this decrease in evenness, which is basically what I have on the slide here. So basically these urban butterfly communities are made up of a few species, so many fewer than we have in less urban areas, but they're highly dominant species. And so we have these communities are not very even. And so they have very different relative abundances. And that's usually because they're dominated by a few species. So we are losing butterfly species in these heavily urbanized areas. The other thing that Steph was looking at, like I mentioned, is that she wanted to look at whether there's certain characteristics of butterflies that lended them to be more sensitive or more sensitive to urbanization. And so at least at the start, we were able to look at the wingspan. So basically how well wingspan is an indicator of how mobile or how far butterflies can disperse. She also considered volatilism, which is the number of generations per season, and then also how many, whether the species were generalists or specialists based on the number of species they use in their caterpillar in their larval stage. And so you can see here that we already have some effects. And so basically species or urban areas or areas that are more urbanized have smaller species. But they also tend to be have species that have larger wingspans. They're actually bigger species. Did I get that right? Sorry, no, volatilism, sorry. They have more generations per given season. And we didn't actually find any impact of the number of host lengths that they use. So there was no effect of generalists. We didn't find any indicator based on generalizations of the species. So overall, this study suggests that urbanization overall is having a negative impact on these butterfly communities. We might be able to use these characteristics of species. So for example, the size of their wingspan or the number of generations they have every year to be able to tell us or predict which species are going to be more sensitive to urbanization than others. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to use this information to prioritize species for conservation management and strategies. So the third part of my talk is focused on species introduction. So again, these are species that have been taken deliberately or by chance from one part of the world to another. And again, the scale of this is staggering. So there's communities that have good proportions of their species that are non-native, especially on islands. It's a huge issue. And so here I have just a few different species. These species are all considered invasive. I don't have time to get into them, but there's a different array of species. I'm sure you recognize some of them. So one of the challenges is that not all species that are introduced from somewhere else become invasive. So as I'm sure you know, so many plant species that are imported as ornamental plants, they persist in gardens because of human assistance and wouldn't be able to establish in less modified habitats. So we don't actually know the fraction of introduced species that actually be established and spread. But for some organisms, it can be quite high. So for example, freshwater fish and mammal and bird species that have introduced, many of them become invasive. So one of our challenges is to try and predict which species of the ones that have been introduced will become invasive. And invasive basically means that you have negative impacts on native communities. So there's some sort of documented evidence that these introduced species have negative consequences. So not all introduced species will become invasive. So what we find interesting in the lab is trying to predict, or one of the aims of invasion biology is to predict, again, which non-native species or which introduced species are likely to become widespread and which ones are going to become abundant. And so, again, basically introduced species and invasive species are those that are going to be undergoing rapid population growth and spread. And so that's why it's really important to be able to predict that. To be able to do that, though, we really need to understand what's constraining the range expansion. So again, across geographical space. And so range expansion can be for a whole number of different reasons for introduced species. So it could be related to what quality of habitat we have here. It could be restricted by the dispersal ability of the species. It could depend on whether their natural enemies are here. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. And so that's why it's really important to sort out which factors are more important. And then again, so identifying the factors likely to influence non-native species is essential for sort of predicting that sort of next phase. So that's the focus of this next project. So within introduced species, this part of the last part of the talk, again, I'm going to focus on two projects to show you the kind of work that we're doing. So again, we're going to go back to Steph's work. This is a different project that Steph, my PhD student, has done. And so she was interested in trying to understand the suitability of habitat for a newly introduced butterfly. And so this was a really interesting case study for us to work on because the species has been relatively newly introduced. And so the European common blue butterfly is native to Europe. So it has a really large distribution from Northern Africa to Norway and Finland. But it was introduced into Montreal around 2005, I believe. It's a small non-migratory butterfly. And the initial reports coming out of Montreal were that their populations could reach really, really high densities, and that the range expansion that was being observed in the early few years was really fast and actually faster than expected. So we wanted to spend a little bit more time figuring out what are the constraints of this species so far, at least around Montreal. The interesting thing about this introduced butterfly is that their main host plant, their main food plant in the larval stage is actually also an introduced plant, an introduced species. And so they primarily like bird's foot trefoil, which again has been introduced to Canada. And so this plant that it uses was introduced in the mid 1700s and now is extremely widespread across Canada. So it was originally imported as a common hay crop, but can now be found growing in every single province in many different habitats across Canada. So we wanted to figure out, again, what was driving its habitat suitability basically around Montreal. So Steph did a couple of different studies. So this was again around Montreal, which is again where it was introduced. And so that's why it made sense to start there. And so she looked, it was the same sites as that other study. So she looked to try and track the habitat in 44 sites around Montreal. And she tracked what like how many of these butterflies she found, and then, associated with different habitat characteristics. The other thing that she did was she did a mark recapture study. So she tracked how far these butterflies flew to be able to give us an index or an estimate of how far they can fly, because we didn't know how far they could fly. So these are her main results. And so she found at a local scale that because these sites, so she found, okay, so what are the factors at a given site? Where are these butterflies occurring at higher abundances? And so she found that the butterflies abundance was highest at sites with some disturbance. So you can see here that the number of individuals was highest at the sort of medium level of disturbance. And so these are sites where, they were mowed every 2 to 3 years. So there was some disturbance, not too much, not too little. We found that they generally were in higher abundances where their preferred host plant was, which, this makes sense, common sense, where the bird's foot trefoil was, where they were present, the butterfly was in higher abundances. And that actually, though, they were found where it's sites where there was lower cover of grasses. And so what we know, at least from this stage, is that this butterfly is limited by the availability of this host plant. But the flip side is that this plant, again, is widespread across Canada. So even if it's limited by the host plant, it's found everywhere. And so that's not going to be a range expansion limiting factor. What we think could slow down its range expansion is the fact that when Steph looked at how far it was flying, it's basically a relatively low dispersal compared to other butterfly species. It really doesn't disperse very far. And so it might take longer to get to spread its range because it can't fly as far distances. So it's just going to take longer time. Okay, so I have about 5 minutes to do the last project. So switching gears a little bit and sort of flipping the species introductions on another, sort of thinking about it in a different way. And so we have a lot of evidence that there are negative impacts of these introduced species, right? We have a lot of evidence that they become invasive, that they have these negative impacts on native communities. But positive interactions, positive benefits of these species are also possible. And so non-native species have the potential to provide food, to provide habitat, or other indirect effects like habitat maintenance. And so we wanted to know whether there's potential positive impacts of non-native species on butterflies. A really good example of this is from Davis, California. And so the non-native plants around the city outnumber natives 5 to 1. So non-native species make up a huge portion of that plant community. And 90% of butterflies use non-natives as a host plant. And so there's evidence from other areas that butterflies are using non-native plants. So we wanted to know, how often is this happening? Again, thinking of butterflies in particular, we focus on nectar because nectar is an essential resource for butterflies. Nectar contains water, sugar, amino acids, all these things that butterflies need. And so it's a main source of energy for flight. And so it affects their lifespan and it affects their fecundity. So this is where we focus our efforts. Interestingly, this is the one study that's not from our region, but I find it really interesting. And so this is actually on Vancouver Island that we did this study. And so this was done in the Garry Oak savanna ecosystems around Victoria. This ecosystem has been heavily impacted by urbanization. And so the Garry Oak ecosystem has been reduced by 95% since 1840 when Europeans colonized this area. So there's like barely anything left of this ecosystem. So the system is heavily at risk. And basically what it looks like, I forgot to include a picture, but it's basically a savanna with these Garry Oak trees that are predominant in the system. And it's Mediterranean, so it has these wet winters and dry summers. And so this is where we focus the study. So Steph went out, I think I forgot to include her. I forgot to include the sites that she went to, but she went to about 10 sites around Victoria, BC to track the plant communities and track the butterfly communities to figure out how often and which plants native butterflies were using, and then when they were using them throughout the season, because we had a feeling that in this community, the non-native species were going to be important at certain times of the year and not other times. And so on this figure, I'm showing you the differences between the native and non-native flowers that butterfly use in this system. And so it's just basically looking at the change in floral area, again, of non-natives and native plant species over the seasons. So she tracked this between May 6th and August 14th. And so what we found was really interesting. So the relative proportion of non-native species was pretty constant over the season, but what happened was that the native species started out quite abundant, as you can see here in blue, and then they declined in abundance throughout the season. So then sort of the relative proportion of non-natives increased through the season because native species dropped out by the end of the season. And in this system, drought is a really major factor. And so drought becomes really important near the end of the season. And so we think that maybe the non-native species have this greater tolerance to drought at the end of the season. And so native species are just not able to compete with non-natives in the same way. When we looked at what was happening on the butterfly side, we found the sort of mirror image of it. So here I'm showing you the number of visits that Steph found of foraging visits. So the number of times the butterflies would essentially visit a flower for nectar. And so again, in blue is the species, the native species that the butterflies were using, and in red are the non-natives. And so because of that shift in the native to non-native species of flower availability, butterflies also shifted what they were using. And so you can see through the season, again, by mid-August, butterflies are using a substantially more non-natives relative to natives. So we found overall that this non-native nectar that they were getting was actually really well integrated into native butterfly diet. So I just have one more slide to get through. And so, hold on, what did I do here? Oh, it looks like I have fancy animation going on here. So just one point is that, so overall the season, we had really high percentage of native butterflies using non-native plants. And so again, 83% of all the visits that Steph found to flowering plants were actually to non-native. And again, this has happened especially later in the season, which is really interesting. And so again, so native butterflies forage on nectar, for nectar on non-native species a lot. But we did find some variation across species. And again, they really did track this seasonal shift in this flower availability. So some of the two implications are basically that these non-native plants can actually potentially have a positive effect to play in this specific ecosystem and potentially others. And so when we think about removing or controlling non-native plants in this system, we might need to think about what we're replacing them with, and to what extent is this going to actually have a negative consequence on butterflies that are actually using these plants in their diet. So that's a whirlwind of all the research that, well, not all the research, but some of the key projects that we've done along those different global change drivers. So I'm happy to answer questions. Here's a long list of people that have helped along the way and some of our funding sources. Thanks for listening.
Wow, thank you, Heather. That was very fascinating. You know, there's so many questions that I'd like to ask, but I want to share the opportunity for other people to ask. But if I may ask the first one, and it's more of a general question, Heather. When the study is finished, what happens to the studies? Is there some agency that collects all these studies? And have you any examples where an organization or a corporation or some group has called on you for your studies in order to improve what they're doing now?
That's a good question. So we, so far, the studies are first published